We're doing pretty well, but we need to move a little bit at a little bit of a pace. Now, ownership of real property is, we looked at what rights we have. Now we're going to look at who owns the property. And so there are several different ways that we can own real estate. One way is just in your own name. You can own real estate, let me get this off the board. You can own real estate by yourself called solely, and the word here they use is severalty. And severalty sounds like several people, but it comes from the word severed. So you can own real estate in your own name even if you're married. So people own real estate in their own name. People who were married before might keep their real estate in their own name. But anybody can buy real estate separately, solely, called severalty. And then there are other types of ownership when you own with other people. And the most common way is probably tenant in common. So I'm just going to put TIC, tenant in common. The word tenant means owner, everybody. We're not talking about renters. Tenants in common. So two or more people own the same property at the same time. This happens, everyone. People buy investment property together. People buy a beach house together. Families do. So this can happen. People who are not married buy property together. So let's look at the illustration on page 35. A and B are owners in common, tenants in common. B dies and wills his interest to C and D. So that shows you right then that A, C, and D are called tenants in common. The other thing I would highlight or write in my notes is when people own property together as tenants in common, it's willable. And you do get questions about who can will and who cannot will. So this is willable. Look at your first paragraph on 35. Second sentence, and important characteristics. Co-owners have unity of possession, but they might have unequal shares. So if you look down at that illustration again, it said A and B are tenants in common. A has 1/2 interest, B has 1/2 interest. So let's pretend like this beach property costs $1 million. A put up $500,000 and B put up $500,000. Does that make sense? But it could have been A could have put up $750,000 and B could have put up $250,000. It could be unequal shares. When I think about shares, I think about the money part. How much do you have in it? It wouldn't matter if A put in $750,000 and B put in $250,000. If it's B's turn to go down to use the beach house, B gets the whole house to use. He doesn't just get that 1/4. Are you with me? There's not going to be a line drawn down the center or partitioned off. Here's your 1/4 of the house you can use because you only put in 1/4 of the money. It's not like that. It's undivided possession and interest, meaning you've got full use of the property.
Does that still count if they were to sell it?
What do you mean?
So like if the one person A puts in $750, do they have any more right over?
They've got 3/4 of the right.
Okay, so when they go to sell it, they have like the majority share?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Did y'all hear the question? Yes, they had the if you put in more money, you're going to get a higher percentage of the profit or whatever. You're going to get back your share. All right, but good point. It's sellable, isn't it? So anyone, A, could go sell their property if they wanted to. They can't sell the whole thing because they don't own it. They can sell their interest in it, which would be, in this illustration, a half interest, right? But do you understand the full use, the unity of possession? Do y'all understand that? It makes sense, doesn't it? Just because you might not have the most money in it doesn't mean you're limited on how much of the space that you can use. All righty. And the space is not like, this is my half, that's your half. It's not divided up that way either. Alrighty, second paragraph, and you got your very important points here, everybody. So you might have test questions in this area. Each owner has an undivided interest. They can sell it, mortgage it, transfer it. They can even will it. Now let's talk about the mortgage part. I do think that would be difficult. The whole idea here is, though, by saying that they can mortgage it, is just letting you know that you do have rights that's not taken away from you. You do have a right to go to the bank and say, can I borrow money against this, but I just have a 50% interest in it. If you're wanting to mortgage the property, I think that would be tricky because you don't own the whole property. And the lender's going to want the whole property as collateral, aren't they? So getting a loan would probably be the better way to word it. But the whole idea is there's not a restriction on what you can do. That's the idea. You can do, you own it, right? And you can do what you could, as if you owned it by yourself in a way. Let's go down to joint tenancy, page 35. Joint tenancy is a little bit tricky in North Carolina. Joint tenancy, they do bring up a feature that distinguishes it from tenants in common. So joint tenancy, everyone, the operative word to me is joint. When people buy property together at the same time, and their intention is to buy it this way, there will be one deed. There are multiple deeds here. Let me go back to this just for a moment. If A and B bought property together, A would get their deed that would say they had 50% share, like in the illustration. B would get their deed saying they have 50% share. If you buy as joint tenancy, there's one deed, one title to the property, and everybody's name would be on it. In other words, this type of ownership, it's almost like you're buying as a unit. You're joined. Everybody's name is on the deed at the beginning. So that tells me if one of the persons wants to sell, then everybody that's on the deed is going to have to sign to transfer to sell that particular share. So you can buy property with others. Let's see if they have an illustration. Go with me to page 36. A, B, and C are joint tenants. Now, unless they tell us otherwise on a test question, that means A has 1/3 interest, B has 1/3 interest, and C does. You know, and we can even put it in the dollars amount if we want to see if we understand it better. This property costs $1 million. A put in $333,000. B put in $333,000, and C did too. Because we all still are putting in our share. The law says it will be presumed equal unless in the deed it's noted that it was unequal. Because A could have all the money, couldn't they, or most of the money, and the other people could still be on the deed by putting in some of the money. But the whole idea is everybody is an owner. So A, B, and C are joint tenants. When C dies, A and B remain as joint tenants. Now think about that statement just for a minute. Aren't A and B still on the deed? They're still on the deed, aren't they? Yes. And nothing's changed with the deed. One of the people just died. And so A and B are still joint tenants. They're still there. Hold that thought for a minute. We're talking about joint tenancy with this feature of right of survivorship. We could call this as one of the owner dies, it goes to the remaining co-owners. It's almost like the last man standing. So if these 3 people want to buy as joint tenant, now in North Carolina they would have to make that clear with an attorney because North Carolina doesn't favor this. North Carolina doesn't favor joint tenancy with this feature, and I'll explain to you in a minute. If they have ownership joint tenant and they have this feature, it's a feature that can be added. It's called the right of survivorship. This illustration is showing you what that means. When one of the owners dies, the remaining owners own the whole property. So if it was 3 people at the beginning, A, B, C is divided into thirds, isn't it? And so when C dies, A and B own 50-50 now. Are you following me? They kind of absorb that third that the last that one that C died and left. So it's not a will, it's just a type of ownership. It's really this feature. Right of survivorship means the surviving co-owners own it. And so A, B, and C own 1/3. C dies, now A and B own 50-50. When B dies, A owns 100%. It keeps going to the remaining co-owners until there is one owner, last man standing, and that one owner owns it solely in severalty. There's not co-owners anymore, so it cannot be joint tenants anymore. Does that make sense? Yes. So joint tenancy is quite unique. It's rarely used in North Carolina, and because the reason is, if somebody wanted to own this way, they would want it because of this feature. Because this feature means you cannot will it now. Right of survivorship means it's not willable anymore. Otherwise, why not buy this way? Why not own it as tenants in common? Can't A, B, and C own as tenant in common? And they could own 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and they each one would have a right to will it. If they choose joint tenancy, because this is the one that you can make not willable. It's the form of co-ownership that the owners can make not willable by having this feature called right of survivorship. And when it's worded exactly right, exactly the way North Carolina says it needs to be worded, it looks like that illustration. Upon the death of one owner, it keeps going to the remaining owners. Question?
That was my question.
Okay. Yeah, it's not willable if it's got that right of survivorship. Guys, I would write in my notes to try to keep it simple. Right of survivorship means it's not willable. And so joint tenancy, with this feature, they've made the ownership not willable.
The last man standing, they can will it.
Sure, because they own it in severalty. But good point. Amber said, but A is the last man standing. A can do whatever they want to do. A can will it then because it's not joint tenant anymore. Does everybody understand that? So go back to page 35 at the bottom. Joint tenancy, most states recognize some form of it. And in your reading somewhere in this paragraph or the next page, it tells you North Carolina doesn't favor it. Well, let me tell you why North Carolina doesn't favor it. A, B, and C, well, let's be fair to the sexes. Let's say A, B, and C are 3 women. Let's say A, B, and C are 3 successful business owners, and they want to buy some property together. And they tell their lawyer they want to buy it as joint tenants with the right of survivorship. What that means is all 3 lady owners, when one dies, it goes to the other lady owners. What about the husbands? Oops. North Carolina doesn't like it. Didn't I tell you North Carolina protects the spouses? North Carolina doesn't like this. That's why in your reading it says you better word it exactly right because North Carolina is going to favor the spouse. You can't oust the spouse, right? Spouse has marital rights. So if you'll look on your paragraph on page 36, under other states, unlike other states, North Carolina does not favor this survivorship clause. North Carolina just doesn't like it because of spouse rights. And so, equal, I mentioned to you unless otherwise said. And North Carolina says the survivorship clause would have to be worded exactly right or you're going to have problems. Now, let me give you something. I want you to hear me real carefully. Does it make sense that the reason two or more people would choose this is so they can get this? Does that make sense? If you want to buy with others, you have options, don't you? And you could choose tenant in common. The reason people buy and choose joint is because they want the right of survivorship. Is everybody with me? That's why they're choosing it. Otherwise, tenant in common is pretty vanilla, and you can will it to anybody. It's pretty good, isn't it? This one makes it not willable. So that would be why you would choose it. Let me give you an example. Gay marriage is legal in North Carolina now, right? Well, it became legal in 2015. So before that, it wasn't legal, was it? Well, have you ever watched Lifetime movies? I have. And when gay couples are married and somebody gets real sick or dies, the mamas and the daddies and the families all get all up in arms and they go crazy and they go, that was mine, I need that, and then they just go crazy and cause a mess. Gay people wanting to protect each other probably chose this way prior to gay marriage being legal. Because buying when you're married, you get the right of survivorship automatically. You're protected as a spouse. But this would have been perfect for a gay couple. Does that make sense? Because they can protect each other. We own it together. You're the co-owner. When I die, you get it. It's not an inheritance. It's not a will. And these other people can't come in and mess it up. It's none of their business anyway.
Oh, like you was using an example where all three women went into buying the property with joint tenants. Okay, what if two of the women are married and the other woman's not? How would that be worded so their spouses wouldn't try to inherit the property?
That's what my point was this, right of survivorship. If it says joint tenancy with right of survivorship, that's saying when I die, you other two get it.
Okay.
That's saying it. But let me just say this, it's above my pay grade, because I've said that a lot, but I still think there would be legal ramifications.
They would have to talk to like a lawyer.
This would be talking to a lawyer, because it could be contested by the spouses, don't you reckon? It could be a mess. Okay? Real quick.
If you want a really quick acronym for joint tenants in common, PITS. North Carolina sees it as the PITS, because they have to have possession at the same time, interest at the same time, title at the same time, and time at the same time. So that's why North Carolina looks at it as the PITS, and they don't honor that right of survivorship clause. It's on page 44 if you want to look at it.
Yeah. That's the thing about joint tenants. You do have to buy at the same time. I mentioned that, didn't I? You're buying and your names are all on the same deed. And so they talk about, you do see what Asher's saying, you do see this word unity a lot. When they're talking about joint tenancy, you see the unity of time, the unity of possession, the unity of title, because they're almost buying it like a unit. Does that make sense? And so everybody's name is on one deed. So that's interesting. Now here's what I want you to hear. When you're asked about this on a test, I want you, if you're asked a question about joint tenancy, I want you to remember this right of survivorship. And I want you to remember, when you get a question about joint tenancy, it's not willable. Is everybody with me? That's the key. Because tenants in common is willable. Why choose the other one? Because we don't want it to be willable. Guys, it could be an estate issue too. I had a student in my class years ago, this divorcee, and she said to me, gosh, I didn't know about this. She said, I'm going to go call my attorney and I'm going to put our property, my house that I own, I'm going to get it redeeded. I want it on my name and my daughter's name. And I want us to have it joint tenants with right of survivorship, because when I die, I want her to own it automatically. It won't be inheritance. Guys, it won't go through the inheritance because the daughter will be the co-owner. So it could be used as an estate planning tool also, couldn't it? So there is a distinction between the two, and Nazar brought up the good one. It's all about the unity for joint. Now, let's look at the bottom of page 36. Now, this could be testing area here too. A, B, and C are joint tenants. So we know just from that statement, A has a third interest, B does, C does, and it's not willable. Didn't we say that? Didn't we also say that anybody can sell their real estate? We did. A sells to D. Now, we said that when you buy as joint tenants, it's at the beginning and everybody's on the deed. Well, C is at A. A wants out. So A sells. You know what? I just visualized when A gets off, the gate closes. Nobody can get back to the original deed, can they? Because they bought it at the beginning at the same time. D does get that 1/3 interest, but D is not a joint tenant because D is not on the original deed. I would keep it that simple if it helps you understand it. D owns 1/3 though, because that's what C owned. D owns 1/3, and guess what? D is called a tenant in common because he's not a joint tenant, right? And what else did we say? It's willable. So D is coming in and buying this 1/3. He owns it as tenant in common, and he can will his share if he wants to. Now I'm telling you, what if A, B, and C at the beginning said, we're going to buy this and we're going to make it not willable? That sure is going to change things, isn't it? A later says, I want to sell. Well, there's no way this person can come in and joint tenant. He's a tenant in common, and it's willable now, and that just kind of might mess up the whole game plan. So I suspect when people buy as joint tenants, if this is the game plan, I suspect they've got other things that a lawyer's handling for them, wouldn't you think? But I would remember, it's possible to have the two original as joint tenant and to have somebody else on this tenant in common.
But if A wanted to sell, they would have to have technically permission from the other two, correct?
Signature.
Signature.
I'm not going to say permission.
So then,
Per
okay.
signature though.
So what would the process be if they know someone else is gonna obviously come in as a, tenant in common, and they don't want it to be willable, that's why they started that process in the first place? Can they fight that, or not?
I wouldn't think they could fight that.
Okay.
What I said was, I think that they would make arrangements in advance in case that happened, is what I'm thinking. For example, if one of us decides that we ever want to sell, give one of the other people first right of refusal.
Right,
And then we can keep it in the mix.
right.
So I think that they would pre-plan it instead of after the fact. After the fact, I don't think there would be anything they could do. I think it would be a pre-plan. We bought a share in a condo at the beach. Golly, it's been over 20 years ago now. And it was really kind of clever how the owner was selling the condo. It's not a timeshare. It's 10 of us bought in. And so it was kind of clever because at the time the real estate market wasn't great, and so he couldn't sell the condo for what he wanted. So he said, I'm going to sell it in tenths. And so, because lots of us can't afford to buy a beachfront by ourselves, can we? And so we bought 1/10 share, somebody bought another 10th, and there were 10 of us. And we're tenants in common. And so, we split up the weeks, and all of us just have a beach place when we want to go down in our particular week. Over time, people wanted to sell their share, and so we had a little pre-agreement. It wasn't joint tenants, it wasn't for this reason, but we had a pre-agreement. If one of us ever wants to sell, give everybody a right first, because we all know who's in this together right now. Give one, and it was even spelled out. Give them a certain amount of time frame. Make the sale available to the other 9 or the other 8 or whoever it is before you just go sell it. So all that can be pre-arranged, which I would think would be really important on this, don't you?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, we need to move a tiny bit. Let's go over to page 37. And let's go, if you look at your second paragraph, you see the right of partition. So if somebody, like you were bringing up about the Kim, right?
Yes,
Kim. Kim was bringing up about, well, what if somebody says, I refuse to sign the deed? Like in this joint? Because technically, I wouldn't think you need the permission, but you could have somebody says, I'm not signing, right? Then the owner would have a right, the co-owner would have a right to go to court to partition, to break up. I want to sell, and they're giving me a hard time. All right, tenancy by the entirety. This is the one that gets most of the students' attention. For example, tenants by the entirety is the only type of co-ownership that the people who buy must be married at the time of the purchase. In North Carolina, if you are married and you buy real estate together, let's say together, because didn't we say you can buy by yourself? But let's say John and Jane Doe want to buy real estate together, and they are married. The law says you own it by tenants by the entirety unless you say you don't want to own it that way. So a married couple buying property together, it defaults to tenants by the entirety in North Carolina unless you say we don't want to own that way. And tenants by the entirety, let's put tenants by the entirety. Tenants by the entirety comes with right of survivorship automatically, which means that when the husband dies, it goes to the wife automatically, no questions asked. When the wife dies, it goes to the husband automatically, no questions asked. So right of survivorship is with tenants by the entirety. And so they must be spouses at the time of the purchase. But spouses have a right to say, well, we want to buy it a different way. Let me give you an example. What if the spouses were married before and the spouses both had children from before? What this means is if you buy tenants by the entirety and upon the death of a spouse, it goes to the remaining spouse, right? And that remaining spouse might not like the other spouse's children. Because when there is a remaining, you own it in severalty, don't you? You can do what you want to, can't you? Unless there's a will that will take precedence. People who've been married before might choose to buy as tenants in common. Because you can make your will and you can say, we're going to buy this as co-owners, but tenants in common. I want a right when I die, I want my part. I put in this thing to go to my kids. I don't want to go into your kids. I want to go into my kids. That's real life, guys. Isn't it? It's real life. And then the other spouse might say, I feel the same way. Hey, we're in agreement. You're putting in half of the money to buy this house. I'm putting in half. And you worked for your stuff. I worked for my stuff. And so we can each have our own separate will. And we can say, and I want my side to go to my kids. Now, to be realistic, it might be something like this. And I'm not a lawyer, but I'm just pretending to be one. It could be something like this. While we're married, if I die, sure, I want my husband to have everything. I don't want him to have to sell the house to get my half out. Are you following me? But since we own it this way, when you die, half of my estate, I want to go to my kids. It's already pre-planned. Does that make sense? So tenants in common, I think, would be pretty common type of ownership, even if people have been married. And when people buy together who are not married, they can choose tenants in common, like people buying a beach house together. So it's a really common way to own real estate with other people. But this tenants by the entirety, look at the characteristics. The owners must be spouses when the title is received. So you must be married when you buy the property to own it this way. For example, what if two people are engaged? Well, then they're not married, are they? They're engaged. And so they buy real estate together. It will not be tenants by the entirety. All right, now listen up. When they get married, it isn't tenants by the entirety either, because they weren't married when they bought it. So when they get married, it will stay the way they bought it unless they go to a lawyer and say, we want to change this so that we're each protected now. Are you following me on that? So you have to be married at the time of the purchase in order to own as tenants by the entirety at the beginning. Now, what if you do, and like we said earlier, what if somebody else owns the house, you're engaged, and the lady owns the house, and then these people get married later? She still owns it in her own name, doesn't she? And it would be severalty. In my opinion, it would be worthwhile seeing a lawyer about that, because this person owns it in severalty, right? And yes, there may be some marital rights that could be contested later, but this person owns it in severalty. And so it's their property. So I would say to somebody, why don't you talk to a lawyer about that, just to make sure your interests are protected. I'm not going to give the advice. I'm not going to say you ought to get it switched to tenants by the entirety, because I think I'm acting like a lawyer without a license then. And so you do have to be careful what you say, right? But does all that make sense? Let's talk about one more thing. Well, actually, let's look at this, these characteristics first. Must be spouses when the title is received. They have rights of survivorship. During the owner's life, it can be conveyed only by both parties. Both parties have to sign because they're both owners. And there's no right to partition that. How can you make your spouse, if you own your house as tenants by the entirety, well, I want to sell my half. Well, it's almost like you don't have a half when you get married. Well, you know, when you get married, some of the vows say you become one. I think I had that one taken out of my vows. But it doesn't feel like it. I don't know. But anyways, but it's almost like you become one. It's almost like that joint tenants we said. It's like there's a unit there, isn't there? Here's one more thing. What if you're married and you own property as tenants by the entirety, and then you get divorced? Well, now, here's a dumb question. Are you married? No, you're divorced. Well, you don't own as tenants by the entirety anymore. It defaults to tenant in common. And so the law says you can own as tenants by the entirety if you're married. Well, if you're not married, you're divorced, the law says it will be tenant in common now, not tenant by the entirety. You don't have to go to court or to the judge. Probably there's going to be court stuff if you're divorcing, but it's just the law. So you don't have to worry about, do I have to have a new deed drawn up? That doesn't have to be a worry, because the law says for you, well, you're not married, you can't own it the married way anymore. It's tenants by the in common. Tenants in common, I should say. Everybody good on that? Now, I did say, if you own property as in severalty and you happen to be married, the spouse needs to sign the title, the deed to transfer the property, because there's that marital interest. Now, I had a student disagree with me a little tiny bit, but I probably proved I was right to him somewhere along the way. But you're entitled to disagree. But anyways, I said, because we were further along in the textbook, we were talking about getting a listing agreement. And you get a call from an owner of property. And you look up, because you can go online and find the deed, and you can find a lot of information online about a property before you even get there. And so you go to the governmental website, Register of Deeds, or wherever that would be. And so you're looking it up, and you see one person's name's on the deed. So somebody owns it in severalty. You get to the property, and you see that they're married now. Everybody with me? Here's what I said to class. I said it would be, you should get both spouses to sign the listing agreement and every single thing at the beginning of this transaction. And the student said, but it only says they have to sign the deed. Well, but that could be a problem, couldn't it? What if the house goes under contract and you didn't get the other spouse to sign the listing, you didn't get the other spouse to sign the sales agreement, and now that you're asking them to sign the deed, they could say, I didn't even agree to any of this. There's going to be a problem. Anybody that has an interest in the real estate should sign the paperwork. So if someone is married, even if they own it in their own name, let's get your spouse to sign the listing agreement. If you go borrow money and you want to buy the house just in your own name, the bank's gonna ask both spouses to sign because they want them both obligated, right? Amber, do you have something you want to say? All right. Questions, comments?
Does it always have to specify on the deed, or does it specify on the deed what type of deed it is?
What type of deed? What do you
In other
mean?
words, it's gonna say on the deed, it's a tenants in common or joint tenant? Or is it
Probably.
inferred somehow by just the way it's worded?
It should say how they own it, because that's gonna be a determining factor on what can be done with it. Now, when you own as, married, I'm trying to visualize mine, it'll either say as husband and wife or tenants by the entire, probably says it all. Probably says it all.
And if it's tenants in common, is it always multiple deeds, or could two different names be on the one deed and still be tenants in common?
Well, there are gonna be multiple deeds. If you and I buy property together, I would have my deed, you would have your deed. But if you and your wife and me and my husband buy property together, couldn't it be my husband and I on one deed and you and your wife on another deed? That's still multiple deeds.
Well, two friends, completely
Two
unrelated.
deeds. Two deeds.
And what if the two names are on one deed? Is it not tenants in common?
I don't know the answer to that. That's a law question. That's a law question. All right, next page, 38. Let's look at common interest, community interest, condominiums, townhouses, timeshares, and cooperatives. Now, you do have test questions in this section, and I mentioned in your review that you really need to make sure you're good with condominium, but everybody, think about how a test question could be worded. If the question is intended to be about a condominium, don't you think they'll throw in some things to steer you wrong about a timeshare or a townhouse, either in the question or either in the answer choices? So in my opinion, I would read this section, even if you know that the question might be about just one of them, because you need to see the distinction. So condominiums look like apartments generally. It was referred to as the Horizontal Act way back when, but generally the condominium looks like stacked housing, generally. It doesn't mean always, but generally speaking, it's like apartment. The thing about buying a condominium, you are buying real estate and you are getting a deed, but what you're getting a deed to is the unit airspace. So in reality, when you buy a condominium, you do not own the walls, you do not own the airspace, you do not own the ground or the subsurface rights by yourself. This is kind of hybrid because all of that will be owned by everyone that has an ownership interest in one of the condos in that development, and everybody would own all of the structure, all of the amenities, the parking, the air rights, the subsurface rights as tenant in common. So you own your individual unit, airspace, not the structure. And then everything else is owned as tenant in common. Co-owners. So undivided interest, wouldn't you have a right to use the entire pool if you wanted to? And parking lot and walking up the stairs and all of that. Now, oftentimes they do have assigned parking or they'll have assigned storage space, but that's just for practicality, not having anything to do with the type of ownership it is. Thing about condominiums is there is a Condominium Act, page 39. When a developer is planning a condominium, he does have to declare and register that. The plat map has to be approved and recorded. They have to create a declaration of bylaws. You know, what are the rules about this? Who's going to manage? How is it, what kind of fees are we going to charge? What kind of amenities? What's the financial situation in regard to this property? And there is some consumer protection. Now, if you read this, I don't know what your thinking was, but here, let me kind of think out loud because I've had this question. I've had questions from buyers, actually. Well, when I make an offer on this house and it's a contract, don't I have 3 days to walk away? And the answer is no. There's not a universal right to walk away from a contract like that. On a brand new condominium, there is a right of rescission, they call it, a right to cancel the contract. And if it's a brand new condo, first transfer, it's 7 days. So that would have to be written and known to the purchaser, wouldn't it? That if you're buying this brand new condo, you've got 7 days to change your mind. Now, on the resale, there's not a 7-day cancellation, but there would have to be a certificate talking about, here's what the dues are. It's an association, and there will be homeowners association dues that will have to be paid. So when you read over this, did it make sense to you? So you're buying a condo. Well, how would this matter to you as a real estate agent? Well, as a real estate agent, you would have to know who, what's involved in the association, what are the monthly or yearly fees, what do they cover, and then there's a thing about square footage. When we are in real estate, we do measure the structure for square footage, not because we have to, it's because we just always have. And so when you're measuring square footage on a condominium, you're not going to count the exterior walls. So in other words, you're going to measure inside wall to wall. So oftentimes you'll hear agents say wall to wall or paint to paint is really more descriptive because you really are not counting the walls. Is everybody with me? Now, it'd be kind of tricky to measure the exterior anyway, unless you're somebody like Spider-Man, but you're not going to measure the exterior. You measure inside paint to paint. Cooperatives are things that it's a type of development and ownership that you're not going to see in this area, I don't think, very much. Usually you see cooperatives in areas where land is scarce and land is expensive, like in New York or Chicago or San Francisco. A developer owns the property, or an entity, a company owns the property. It makes me think of, like in New York, maybe a developer sees this apartment building that he can see, he can visualize that this can be a good investment, but it needs work. And so the developer decides to buy that apartment building, but he needs money to do the work. And so he says, I'm not going to use my money. I'm going to sell stock in this corporation, and the people who buy the stock give me the money and I use it for the improvement. And the people who buy the stock get stock certificate, called personal property, isn't it? And the people who get that get a right to rent one of the apartments once that they have been refurbished. And so on a cooperative, you don't own real estate if you're a stockholder. You own the stock and you get what they call a proprietary lease, a right to rent it as long as the corporation is viable. Kind of like shows on TV, Frasier, I think they live in a cooperative. Jerry Seinfeld show, I think that's a cooperative. Just the way I've heard some of the episodes. Well, so-and-so's moving out, I'm going to put my name in and see if I can get that apartment. It just feels like there's some sort of a cooperative situation where they've got more interest in that apartment other than just, I'm just renting. You know, it just feels like there's more to it. Alrighty, next page, 40. Townhouse ownership. Townhouses typically are vertical. You know, they look like a row house you might see in pictures in Charleston. You know, so they're usually vertical, 2 stories, 1 story, 3 stories even, like with a basement. They are horizontally attached. So they are attached, you would even call it a party wall. When a person buys a townhouse, they are buying the structure. And they are buying the land underneath and the heir to infinity. They are buying a structure. As a real estate agent, if you're going out to measure a townhouse to put on the market, you do measure exterior or at least count for the exterior walls. The exterior walls would be 6 inches on each wall. So if the way the townhouses are attached, you can't get a good measurement by trying to tape off outside. If you measured inside to inside, you're just gonna add 6 inches to the outside walls, because technically that's what you're buying when you buy a townhouse. Now, there's something different about townhouse ownership. There would be a homeowners association, because there's gonna be parking, there may be pool and tennis, maybe not, but there will be a homeowners association. The homeowners association is owned by a separate entity. So it's not a tenant in common thing like the condominium. A separate entity owns the association in a townhouse community. Now, everybody who lives there is gonna pay association dues for the maintenance of the amenities. Does that make sense? But guys, I would remember that distinction. In a condominium development, the owners own everything as tenants in common. In a townhouse development or community, the association owns that, and the owners there are members, and they pay association dues. There's no right of rescission on a townhouse purchase. You know, it feels more like you're really buying real estate because you own the walls. Can you imagine buying a condominium, for example, and then you kind of get away and you say, ooh, this feels funny, I don't even own my walls, I don't know. You know, it's kind of just a hybrid, kind of a mixed bag. And so that's why there's a right of rescission there on the first purchase. Let's talk about timeshares. I know you've heard of timeshares, and timeshares over the years, over years past, have kind of gotten a bad reputation. Why do you think so? Why do you think timeshares have a bad reputation? Because of the sales method. You know, it just feels like they're just sell, pushing, overselling us, and come down here for the weekend, you'll get a free weekend, we'll get a big screen TV. Huh?
Don't do it like her.
High pressure sales.
High pressure sales tactics. Well, you are buying real estate when you buy a timeshare. Now, I would remember the definition, because that's a good test question. So let's look at timeshare. Any right to occupy during 5 or more separate periods over a period of at least 5 years. Guys, students who have been in my class before have heard this, because I basically say the same thing. I call it my subway rule. Subway subs, they used to be the rule, didn't they used to have a $5 foot long?
Yeah.
It's corny, but this is my subway rule. So I think about my subway rule, and it's the rule of 5s. When you buy into a timeshare, you're buying at least 5 separate periods. Guys, it's the definition. If you get a question and it says you bought 2 periods, it's not a timeshare. Don't know what it is, I'm not going to worry about it, but it's not a timeshare. Alrighty, so you're buying at least 5 separate periods over at least 5 years. If it said you bought it over 2 years, it doesn't meet the definition, does it? These are your clues. There is a 5-day rescission. So there's 5 days right to cancel when a contract on a timeshare. There's another 5 days, so I'm going to kind of put that together that away just to stay in the 5s. There's 10 days that the timeshare developer cannot spend any of the monies that the purchaser may have put down. For the example, if the purchaser wants to buy and they put down a down payment, the timeshare developer cannot spend the money for 10 days. The way I remember the 5s is, the first 5 days is for cancellation, and then there's another 5 days tacked on, that the timeshare developer cannot use the money. And then this last 5 is $500. Timeshare developers who do not have a broker license can be fined $500 for every violation of any license, law, or commission rule. Unlicensed, now I want you to pay attention, unlicensed timeshare developers. Now, I'm not talking about guys, to be a developer, you don't get a developer license. I'm talking about not having a broker license, right? They don't have a broker's license, and most developers don't. But unlicensed timeshare developer can be fined $500 per violation of license law by the Real Estate Commission. Now, why that's important to you is this reason. When you get your real estate license, and if a complaint is brought about you to the Real Estate Commission and they review it, they can discipline you, but they will never fine you. The commission does not issue monetary fines on licensees. Let me tell you what they can do, and you might want to write this down. What the commission can do if you're being disciplined, they can censor you. C-E-N-S-U-R-E, censor you. They can reprimand you. They can suspend your license, or they can revoke your license. So they can censor, reprimand, suspend, or revoke. Censor means this. Let me put it in my own words if you don't mind. Censor is public humiliation. When you get your license, the Real Estate Commission, the Real Estate Commission puts together a bulletin, and it gets mailed to every licensee in North Carolina about every 2 months. And most of us, unfortunately, will go to the back page, well, now it's about 4 pages, of the bulletin. That's where if somebody got disciplined, a real estate licensee, their name, their city, their company, and what they did and what happened to them is in that bulletin. That's kind of public embarrassment, isn't it? Could even be in your local newspaper, just depending on whatever it is you did. So that's called censor. Reprimand is a black mark in your file. And suspend your license, well, we're going to say you can't use your license for 90 days because of this is what you did. And then revoke is you don't have a license. So they can do that, but they can't fine a licensee. All righty, let me give you a couple of more things about timeshares. It might not be written right there, and maybe it is, but let me just give you this. A timeshare development must have a registrar, kind of like a college registrar. A timeshare development must have a registrar. The registrar for the timeshare development is the person who is responsible for the recordation of certain documents. By the way, if the timeshare development does not have a registrar, it's a felony. North Carolina has a Timeshare Act. They've really gotten strict because of the overzealous high-pressure sales. The timeshare development has to have a project broker also. Project broker. Remember the other day I mentioned to you that you and I are going to affiliate with a broker in charge? Well, a timeshare development doesn't have a broker in charge per se. They've got a project broker who oversees. And the other thing I wanted to tell you is anyone who sells timeshares must have a broker's license now. So whenever if you're looking down at any resort area in North Carolina and you want to buy a timeshare, that person has to have a broker's license. So the Real Estate Commission is involved, and so, overseeing this now. So hopefully the timeshare trade has gotten a little bit better. I know there was a time that it really had negative connotations to it. Now, the last thing I want to mention is planned unit development. This is more of a way of developing instead of an ownership kind of thing. More of a way of developing. Have you been to any subdivision, big or small, where you drive through and you have the roads, but most of them end in cul-de-sacs? You know, that's kind of a way of development. The cul-de-sacs gives the illusion of more openness. The lot might be a little bit smaller and maybe a little smaller frontage, but it gives that openness feeling, and there might be like a little circle there with flowers and trees, but it's a way of development. PUD areas oftentimes have different types of zoning in there too. So you might see large PUD developments like Adams Farm or Bermuda Run in Winston, where you do have different types of structures, and you've even got commercial property. So if you go out to Adams Farm between Greensboro and Jamestown, you'll see Harris Teeter. On the back end of this Adams Farm, you'll see doctor's offices and things like that, and it's in the whole development. And you've got residential apartments, detached housing, attached housing, and it's just a planned development called a PUD. Now, you all can read over this trust section. I think it'll make sense to you, but I'll hit it when we get back. Now, let me just remind you that I will notify you this afternoon. It might be late this afternoon about what we're going to do for class. If we can have it, it'll probably be good that we do, so that we can stay on some sort of time frame. But if it looks like we shouldn't, we'll send you out an email either way, so you won't be worried about it. And then I'll have the voicemail on if there's anything. Everybody good?